Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take the complexity of history. And today, that's the legal and political foundations of the ancient world, and really drill down into the insights you need. Our mission is simple. Take your source material, build that shortcut so you're truly well-informed, find those surprising bits you won't get in a standard overview.
Right, and today we're doing a really critical comparative study. We're jumping between classical Athens, the heart of democracy, maybe a bit volatile, and then over to Republican and imperial Rome, that engine of formalism, of empire. What ties these sources together, though, is seeing how their legal systems actually evolved. Sometimes, adapting quite elegantly, but other times just buckling under the pressure of politics and, well, entrenched social status.
Yeah, it's a fantastic set of sources we've got. It lays out everything from how citizen juries work, the mechanics of it, right through to the, let's say, colder reality of imperial bureaucracy and property law in Rome. We're not just mapping out the laws themselves, are we? We're looking at the power struggles that really shape them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the big question we're trying to answer for you today, the learner, is precisely that. How did political ambition, how did that deep-seated social status either warp these ancient legal structures or maybe solidify them? We want to get underneath the surface, see the human, the political factors hiding beneath that idea of impartiality, whether we're talking Athens or the huge Roman Empire.
Okay, perfect. So let's dive in, starting with where this idea of citizen justice, well, arguably hit its peak and maybe showed its potential cracks, classical Athens.
Yeah, the Athenian judicial system.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally tied to the massive citizen juries. These were absolutely central. This is the core, really, of the democratic constitution. It's in those law courts where the demos, the sovereign people, they exercised their actual power. They were judging cases, they were effectively legislating, they were holding officials accountable, all in one place. But, and this is key, concentrating power like that. It also created some pretty distinct vulnerabilities.
It's just staggering when you think about the sheer scope of what these courts covered. I mean, it wasn't just minor disputes like neighbors arguing over livestock. The sources really highlight this mechanism, the graphe paranomen. Can you remind us what that was?
Right, the graphe paranomen translates roughly as the indictment for illegality. Essentially, it was a public action. Any citizen could use it to challenge the legality, even the constitutionality, of decrees that had already been passed, passed by the ecclesia, the main assembly, or even the Senate.
Wow. So a law gets passed, everyone votes, and then afterwards someone can take it to court and say, hold on, that wasn't legal.
Exactly. And that right there is a huge insight into maybe the systemic instability of Athenian democracy. Think about it in practice. Every single legislative decision made by the people could then be hauled before a jury for review. It basically gave the political losers a second chance to kill legislation they couldn't stop in the assembly.
So the jury court becomes this ultimate check on the entire democratic machine. It's like the everyday work of the city's government is under this constant threat of being overturned by another group of citizens later. It's decentralization taken to an extreme, maybe. Must have caused endless friction.
Oh, it did. And what's really crucial to get here is how utterly different this system was from how we think about legal enforcement today. We rely on professionals, state prosecutors, police, crown services, whatever the local equivalent is, government funded.
Yeah.
Athens, none of that. It was almost entirely dependent on private initiative for prosecutions.
So wait, if some top official was, say, embezzling funds or even committing treason, it wasn't the state automatically investigating. Just some ordinary citizen had to decide to step up, spend their own time, their own money, and actually bring the charge.
Precisely. That was the default. And the public talk, the rhetoric around this was really important. If a public official did decide to launch a major political prosecution, they often made a big show of saying they were acting just like a private citizen, motivated purely by selfless, public-spirited concern. It was a democracy kind of powered by civic duty, or at least a very convincing performance of it.
Okay, but surely there were times when a case was just too big, too important for one person to handle. Did the state never step in?
It did, occasionally, but usually only temporarily. We see this perfectly in that famous trial of Demosthenes himself. When he was facing charges over bribes from Harpalos, Alexander the Great's runaway treasurer. Big scandal.
Right, I remember that one.
So for really major cases like that, cases with huge political implications, the state would sometimes appoint special, temporary synagoroi. Public advocates, essentially, just for that specific prosecution. But the fact that it was temporary, ad hoc, that just reinforces the main point. Athens deliberately avoided having a permanent, professional state machine dedicated to hunting down political enemies, or prosecuting major crimes. The whole system was designed to push citizen action over state bureaucracy.
Okay, so we've got this idea of private prosecution for the public good, but that power, well, it had a dark side, didn't it? The sources talk about the sycophant problem. Sounds ominous.
It was, absolutely. The sycophant is a fascinating term, comes from the Greek for fig informer, maybe originally someone who snitched on illegal fig exports, bizarrely. But it came to mean a kind of professional haranguer, a vexatious litigant. This was a citizen, often quite skilled rhetorically, who knew the law, knew how to play the crowd, and would threaten legal action, often against wealthy citizens, basically as a form of blackmail.
Just from...
Often, yes. Purely for financial gain. And the sources suggest that if you were a, let's say, quiet, wealthy, law-abiding Athenian, facing one of these sycophants who could weave a plausible story and really knew how to manipulate a jury's emotions, it was terrifying. The potential penalties were huge, massive fines, maybe even losing your civic rights entirely.
So it could ruin you.
It could. And here's the tragedy, maybe the biggest indictment of how well the system actually worked in practice. When you're faced with this threat, a lawsuit that looks legally sound, even if it's completely malicious and you know you're facing a huge, unpredictable jury, the sources explicitly say that just buying off the accuser became the simpler and safer way. Simpler and safer than actually trusting the courts to protect you.
Wow. So the integrity of this whole people's justice system was constantly being undermined because the law itself could be so easily twisted into a weapon for personal profit.
Precisely. The very popular power it was built on became its weakness. Now, shifting slightly, the sheer power of these central jury courts also had this kind of gravitational effect on everyday disagreements. Even purely private disputes ended up being framed with the courts in mind from the very beginning.
How so?
Well, say you had a personal quarrel, a dike. You might try private arbitration first, but everyone knew that decision could probably be appealed to one of these big public jury courts. And just that possibility, that shadow hanging over the arbitration, it forced people, the disputants, to start thinking legally. They had to seek out specific laws, maybe even hire experts, to help them, and this is a great phrase from the source, transform the original quarrel. So it fit the court's accepted categories of wrong, concepts of relevance, and specific notions of proof.
Wait, hang on. So just the anticipation of maybe ending up in court forced you to frame your argument in the state's terms right from the start, even if you were hoping to settle it quietly between yourselves?
Exactly. It suggests the system wasn't just about resolving disputes when they happened. It was actively shaping how people even thought about their disagreements, standardizing legal thinking according to the state's rules and categories. The prospect of that final public judgment became this powerful centralizing force on all legal thought, making sure even private citizens viewed their conflicts through the lens of state law. Hashtag P3, morality, rhetoric, and the family in Athenian law.
Okay, moving on. It seems Athenian law was never really separate from politics, was it? It feels like it was the main political battlefield. The sources make this incredibly clear with that constant struggle between, say, the pro-war and pro-peace factions, especially that massive rivalry between Demosthenes and Aeschines over Philip of Macedon.
Oh, absolutely. That whole series of impeachment proceedings between Demosthenes and Aeschines is just a masterclass in how the law could be completely weaponized for political ends. Demosthenes impeaches Aeschines, right, accuses him of basically treason, taking bribes from Philip, but the actual facts of the bribery, almost secondary to the political narrative being spun.
But Demosthenes, despite being this brilliant orator, his whole case kind of unraveled, didn't it? And not because of anything to do with Philip or bribes, but because of personal morality.
It did. It's fascinating. Demosthenes made the mistake of associating himself publicly with a man named Timarchus. Now, Timarchus, in his youth, had apparently engaged in activities likely related to prostitution, which under Athenian law disqualified him from holding civic rights, from speaking in the assembly.
So his past came back to bite him.
Massively. Aeschines, fighting for his political survival, seized on this. He brought a separate action specifically against Timarchus, dragging his entire private life out into the open in excruciating, damaging detail. And by destroying Timarchus' reputation and legal standing, Aeschines completely torpedoed Demosthenes' credibility as a prosecutor. He basically argued, how can this man, who associates with someone morally compromised like Timarchus, possibly have the standing to pursue justice against me?
That's just incredible. In a system supposedly about citizen justice, a huge public case concerning potential treason gets completely derailed by allegations about the sexual history of an associate. It really makes you question the efficiency, doesn't it? Was the law just becoming secondary to social gossip and character assassination?
It absolutely was, or at least it could be. The law was inherently moralizing. Winning your case wasn't just about the facts. It was about presenting yourself and everyone connected to you as virtuous, upstanding citizens. The stakes were incredibly high, so you had this combination of, yes, formal judicial process, but paired with this really profound moral gravity. And this was enforced through specific rituals, too.
Like the Herald's Curse you mentioned.
It's exactly like the Herald's Curse. In that very same dispute, Ice Kings was actually the legally designated target of the public Herald's Curse. For being a deceiver, the charge was he thinks one thing but says another. This wasn't just name-calling. It was a formal, solemn, religious, and legal condemnation, right there in the public forum. It really underlines that the judicial process wasn't just aiming to find facts. It was trying to enforce civic sincerity, moral uprightness.
This focus on the city's moral order, it also seems to reflect a bigger cultural shift, right? Moving away from that older aristocratic world dominated by the individual household, the oikos, towards the democratic city, the polis.
That's a crucial historical transition. In earlier societies, like the world Homer describes, problems like violence, revenge, think of the Odyssey, all that bloodshed could be dealt with almost entirely within the family structure, within the oikos. The family took justice into its own hands, which, of course, often led to those endless, destructive cycles of vendetta. The democratic polis had to find a way to break that cycle.
And that's where Aeschylus's Oresteia comes in, according to the sources.
Precisely. The Oresteia trilogy is so foundational because it literally stages the problem. It takes that old bloody story of family revenge, Agamemnon's murder, Clytemnestra's murder, Orestes pursued by the Furies, and puts it on trial, literally, before the new democratic culture.
The trial of Orestes at the end.
That trial, judged by the Areopagus, the Athenian court, with Athena herself presiding, it's this essential symbolic moment. It establishes the city, its laws, its institutions, as the proper place for resolving even the most ancient and primal conflicts, like homicide. It's a statement. Moral authority moves from that cycle of private vengeance to public state-sanctioned justice. The private sphere is now, theoretically at least, subordinate to the public.
Okay, but while the polissa took charge of public justice, the sources suggest the oikos, the household, still held on to quite a bit of legal power, especially around things like marriage and property within the family.
Yes, that's right. Athenian marriage, it was typically set up through ongui, which was the betrothal or promise, and egdosis, the actual handing over of the bride. This was an agreement between the husband and the wife's male kin, her kyrios. Once married, the wife technically fell under her husband's authority, his kyria. However, and this is important, her birth family didn't just wash their hands of her. They maintained a strong, ongoing interest in her well-being.
Especially concerning her dowry, I imagine.
Absolutely. Proper management of the dowry was key, but also just the general congeniality of the husband. Was he treating her well? This continuing connection, this oversight from her natal family, actually gave the wife considerable leverage, even without formal political rights.
How did that leverage work in practice?
Well, for the husband, the underlying threat was always there. If he mismanaged the dowry or treated his wife badly, her family might intervene. And that could lead to divorce, which meant he'd lose the dowry, often a substantial sum. So this threat provided the wife with significant moral support and, in serious cases, actual practical help in leaving the marriage and taking her property with her. It acted as a kind of social safety net, backed by potential legal action.
And the law provided specific ways to enforce this. It wasn't just social pressure.
No, the law was specific. The sources mention clear procedures. The dike praekos, which was the lawsuit to recover the dowry itself, and also the dike situ, a suit to recover maintenance or alimony. These legal tools ensured that the financial well-being of a divorced wife wasn't just left to chance. It was a matter the courts could enforce. It really shows how democratic laws didn't just ignore the household. They actively shaped and protected the financial dynamics within it. Okay, let's make that jump now, geographically and chronologically, over to Rome. And if Athens was all about, that volatile popular initiative, the power of rhetoric, early Roman law offers a real contrast. Its foundations are rooted in really strict formalism and, initially at least, this absolute power within the patriarchal family.
That contrast is really stark. In Athens, it feels like the underlying morality, the story you could tell the jury, mattered hugely. But in early Rome, the sources seem to say it was almost the opposite. The ritual, the exact procedure, was more important than intent.
Absolutely. Early Roman law is almost defined by what the sources call the essential formalism of archaic law. And there's this idea that procedure dominated substance. The specific actions you took, the precise words you had to use in court, the formulas, they mattered more than the underlying truth or fairness of the situation. Make a mistake in the procedure, use the wrong wording. Your case could be dead in the water no matter how right you were.
And this rigid formalism seems perfectly captured by that fundamental distinction they made in property law. It really tells you a lot about early Roman priorities. Tell us about the two types of property, the res mancipi idea.
Right, res mancipi and res nec mancipi. This is just bedrock early Roman legal thinking. Res mancipi were basically the most important things for an early agricultural society. Think land in Italy, slaves, and those specific working animals, horses, oxen, donkeys, mules, the absolute core assets.
Okay, the essentials for a farm, basically.
Exactly. And to transfer ownership of these res mancipi, you couldn't just hand them over. You needed this ancient formal ceremony called mancipatio. It involved bronze, scales, specific words, and 5 Roman citizens as witnesses. Highly ritualized.
Sounds like a pretty robust way to make sure everyone knew who owned the really important stuff and to prevent fraud.
It was designed for that certainty. But here's the really crucial part. The list of things that counted as res mancipi was, as the source says, irrevocably closed. It couldn't be added to. New types of wealth didn't qualify.
What does that tell us? Why keep the list closed?
Well, it suggests a deep-seated conservatism. It looks like resistance, probably from the established landed patrician families, against giving the same secure legal status to newer forms of wealth, maybe large amounts of cash, gold, imported luxury goods, things gained through trade or commerce, not inherited land. They were protecting the traditional assets of the ancestral estate, above all else, through the legal structure itself.
So the law was almost baked in to favor the old landed aristocracy over a potentially rising merchant class.
That seems to be the effect, yes. Now, contrast that with res nec mancipi. That was basically everything else, anything not on that short closed list. And for these things, ownership could be transferred just by simple physical delivery traditio. Hand it over, it's yours. And this list, the source notes, could expand indefinitely. Every new invention, every new type of good discovered or traded automatically fell into this less formal category. So that distinction really is a powerful lens on Roman economic thinking and social structure.
The sources also show how this early rigid structure defined the family itself, didn't it? With the immense power of the paterfamilias.
Oh, the power of the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, was legally almost absolute in early law. Under this system, patria potestas, people under power, that meant wives in certain types of marriage, sons, daughters, grandchildren through the male line, and slaves, legally, they couldn't own property in their own right. The paterfamilias owned everything.
Everything, even if an adult son earned money.
Legally, it belonged to the father. And this had huge legal consequences. If a son, even an adult son, committed a crime or caused harm, the lawsuit wasn't against him, it was against his father. The father then had the choice: pay the damages or hand the son over to the injured party, a process called noxal surrender.
So legally speaking, individuals within the family were almost extensions of the paterfamilias' legal personality. That must have really restricted economic life for people, especially adult sons wanting to do business.
It certainly did, though mechanisms evolved later to mitigate this, like the peculium. And this control extended to disposing of family assets, too. Take wills, for example. Originally, wills weren't just a private document. They were executed publicly in a special assembly called the comitia collata. This suggests that deciding who got the family property after death was seen as a public matter, needing community recognition, not just an individual's private decision. The idea of just writing down your wishes privately. That's a much later development in Roman law. Hashtag tag V status, privilege, and imperial justice in Rome.
Okay, so Rome grows. From republic to this massive empire, that old, rigid formalism couldn't just stay static, could it? The legal system had to adapt, become more sophisticated. But it seems like it kept, maybe even intensified, its deeply hierarchical nature.
That's exactly right. This is where you see the Roman legal mind really flexing its muscles, creating incredibly complex, nuanced law to govern this huge, diverse empire. But, and this is the critical point, they applied that law selectively. Birth, class, status, these remained absolutely central.
And nothing shows that stratification, that hierarchy, injustice, better than this dual penalty system that emerged under the empire. This part of the sources, I have to say, is where it gets really eye-opening, because the law itself seems to formally approve of treating people differently based purely on class.
It absolutely did.
Yeah.
By the time of emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, so early 2nd century AD, the system is clearly visible. Roman society was formally divided for penal purposes into 2 broad groups, the honestiores and the humiliores. Your group determined the type and severity of punishment you'd likely receive.
Okay, break that down. Who are the honest yours, the more honorable ones?
These were the upper crust. You're talking senators and their families, the knights, equidates, local bigwigs in the towns and cities across the empire, the municipal aristocracies, soldiers, veterans, generally the wealthy and influential. For them, if they committed a crime, the penalties were generally the milder, more traditional ones found in the statutes. Things like exile, deportation, maybe losing status, or heavy fines. Punishments, yes, but ones that sort of respected their social standing.
Right. Still unpleasant, but not degrading in the same way. And the humiliores, the lower ones, the masses.
Ah, the humiliores. This was everyone else, the vast majority of the population. For them, the penalties were far harsher, often involving physical degradation and pain. These were often called administrative sanctions rather than formal legal penalties. We're talking things like being sentenced to forced labor in the mines at Metalla, being branded, flogged severely, thrown to wild beasts in the arena at Basias, or even crucifixion.
Punishments that had previously been used mostly for slaves or non-citizens.
Exactly. Those incredibly harsh punishments, previously reserved mainly for slaves and foreigners, were now being routinely applied to Roman citizens, provided they were from the lower classes, the humiliores.
That is just chillingly effective as a tool for social control. The actual punishment you receive might depend less on the crime itself and more on who your parents were, how much money you had, your birth status.
Precisely. The punishment system became a direct, brutal reflection and reinforcement of the empire's rigid social hierarchy. And this whole principle was enforced through a fundamental shift in legal procedure itself, away from the old republican ways.
You mean the move towards the cognitio procedure?
Yes, the cognitio extra ordinem, or extraordinary procedure. In the old republican jury courts, the magistrate, the praetor, acted more like a referee, overseeing a contest between a private accuser and the defendant. The cognitio, which became dominant under the empire, was different. It was inquisitorial.
Meaning the judge took a much more active role.
A vastly more active role. The judge, often an imperial official, investigated the case, summoned witnesses, interrogated the accused directly, and crucially had enormous discretion in deciding the sentence. He wasn't strictly bound by statutory penalties. He could sentence based on his own judgment, guided vaguely by reason or equity.
And because this judge was usually an imperial appointee, part of the establishment, his personal discretion would naturally reflect his own background, his own class biases, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. The sources suggest the imperial judge was pretty much free to choose penalties based on his assessment of the crime's seriousness and his own social prejudices. This effectively blurred the lines between judicial decision-making and executive power. It created the perfect legal framework for enforcing that brutal dual penalty system across the provinces.
Now, shifting gears slightly, but still related to the empire structure. The sources mention something fascinating, almost paradoxical, about how the Roman bureaucracy was staffed. That slavery was actually a major source for recruiting highly skilled, educated people, doctors, administrators.
Yes, it's one of those historical ironies. Running a massive, complex empire required a huge administrative apparatus. It needed educated people with specialized skills: accountants, secretaries, record keepers, even doctors for state service. And a primary source for these individuals, especially in Italy, was educated slaves, often captured or bought from the Greek East or other Hellenized areas, and also freedmen, ex-slaves.
But why weren't freeborn Roman citizens rushing to fill these important, often powerful administrative jobs? It seems strange that the government of, originally a free republic, would rely so heavily on people who were legally unfree or formerly unfree.
It boils down to a deep-seated cultural prejudice among the Roman elite and even ordinary free citizens. Traditionally, they really disliked the idea of long-term employment, especially working for someone else, even the state. Taking orders, being tied to a desk job, reporting to a superior day in, day out. They viewed that kind of permanent employment as restricting their personal freedom, their libertas. It made them feel constrained, as the source puts it, like slaves.
Wow. So serving the state in a bureaucratic role felt servile.
To many traditional Romans, yes. Faced with this widespread cultural attitude, emperors often found it much easier and more practical to staff the growing imperial administration, largely with skilled slaves and freedmen who didn't have the same hang-ups about long-term service and taking directions.
So the very machinery of Roman governance, the complex system managing this vast empire built on ideas of citizenship and freedom, was often run day to day by people who lacked full legal freedom themselves. What an incredible contradiction.
A huge irony indeed. But let's not lose sight of the sheer sophistication of Roman law itself, beyond just status and bureaucracy. If you dig into the details, especially in the later compilations like Justinian's Digest, you find incredibly nuanced legal concepts. These really show why Roman law had such a lasting impact.
Okay, let's look at an example. The sources highlight the law around deposit, basically, safekeeping someone else's property. How did that show legal nuance?
Well, the law made a very sharp distinction. It depended on why the deposit was made. Was it a voluntary deposit? You ask a friend to look after your luggage while you're away, or was it a necessary deposit?
What counted as necessary?
The law lists specific crisis situations. On account of tumult, fire, disaster, or shipwreck. Situations where you have no choice but to quickly entrust your property to someone nearby for safety.
Okay, so voluntary versus forced by circumstance. Why did the liability differ?
If it was a voluntary deposit and the item was lost or damaged through the depositary's negligence, they were liable for simple damages of the value of the item. But if it was a necessary deposit made in that moment of crisis and the depositary failed in their duty, or worse, stole the item, the liability was double damages.
Double what?
It's not just about compensation. It's sending a message. The source explains that betraying trust when someone is forced to rely on you out of sheer necessity during a fire, a shipwreck that's considered a greater public crime. It damages social cohesion at the worst possible moment. The higher penalty reflects a moral judgment about betraying trust in a crisis.
That's fascinating. The law isn't just about property. It's actively trying to reinforce public trust and good behavior during emergencies.
Exactly. It's a glimpse into the underlying social values embedded in the law. And maybe one more quick example. Looking at women's status and wealth, especially around inheritance and remarriage.
Yes, how did that work under later Roman law?
Well, even under the empire, there were provisions like the ius liberorum, literally the right of children. If a mother had borne a certain number of children, usually 3 for freeborn women, 4 for freed women, she gained certain legal advantages, including greater rights to inherit and manage property independently.
So motherhood conferred some legal status.
It did. However, there were still constraints, particularly designed to keep wealth within the original family line. If a widow who had inherited from her first husband, maybe benefiting from this ushered liberorum, decided to remarry, the law often stepped in.
How?
In many cases, she would only retain the usufruct of the property she inherited from her first husband. That means she could use it, take the income from it, like rent from land, but she didn't own it outright. The actual ownership, the dominium, might automatically pass to her first husband's children, or even his siblings, upon her remarriage. The law was actively preventing the first husband's family wealth from potentially flowing into the control of the new husband and his family. Again, it shows the law intervening directly in personal life to manage property along very specific traditional lines.
Right, so let's pull this all together. We've journeyed through Athens, then Rome, seen these two absolute giants of the ancient world and how they approached law and justice. On one hand, Athens, vibrant, maybe chaotic, centered on the citizens' power in court, their individual initiative. On the other, Rome, starting formal, rigid, evolving into this highly complex system, but always stratified by status and concerned with property.
I think that's the core contrast, yeah. Athens really tried to put judicial power directly into the hands of its citizens. Think of the graphe paranomon, again, citizens challenging laws after they passed. The result, maybe dynamism, but also intense political volatility. The system getting hijacked by those sycophants, political scores being settled through impeachment.
Whereas Rome, it started out so conservative, didn't it? Focused on those strict property rules like res mancipi, the absolute power of the father. Then, as it grew, it built this incredibly sophisticated legal machine, this jurisprudence. But it used that machine to codify power, to enforce social hierarchy. Think of that dual penalty system, the huge power given to the judge in the cognitio procedure. It was a system fundamentally built to manage and maintain a class structure.
Definitely. But the common thread, maybe, despite all the differences, is how both systems were ultimately vulnerable to manipulation.
Yeah.
Powerful people found ways to use the legal rules, whether Athenian rhetoric or Roman procedure, for their own political or personal advantage. Aeschines using a moral attack to wreck Demosthenes' case in Athens, or that Roman imperial judge deciding who counts as humiliores based on his own prejudices. The human element, you could say, always found a way to shape how justice was actually delivered.
It really seems like early archaic law was obsessed with status and formalities, who you were mattered most. Then Athenian democracy put a huge emphasis on individual initiative, what you did or said, for good or ill.
Which brings us to that final, maybe provocative thought for you, the learner, to mull over. You've got these two foundational legal cultures. Now imagine you have to govern a vast, complex, multi-ethnic, information-heavy empire like Rome became. Which of those core ideas proves more, well, adaptable, more sustainable as a basis for justice on that massive scale? Is it the Roman focus on status, order, and formality? Or is it the Athenian ideal, however flawed, of individual initiative and popular voice? Which concept, status, or individual action holds up better under the weight of empire? It's a tension, I think, that still echoes in Western legal traditions today.
Definitely food for thought. And on that note, that wraps up this deep dive. We hope you feel thoroughly well-informed now about the complex, sometimes brutal, but always fascinating world of ancient justice in Athens and Rome.
Until next time.